Marcus Delaney wiped the sweat from his brow as he surveyed the parched fields that stretched endlessly before him. The corn stalks stood barely knee-high, their leaves curled and brown despite his constant irrigation efforts. The Nebraska sun beat down mercilessly, turning what should have been fertile farmland into something resembling a desert wasteland. His grandfather's farm, once the pride of Lancaster County, now looked like a testament to failure. The bank notices stuffed in his kitchen drawer served as daily reminders that time was running out, but Marcus refused to let despair consume him entirely. This land had fed his family for 3 generations, and he wasn't about to be the one to let it slip away without a fight. The morning had started like any other, checking the irrigation lines and praying for rain that meteorologists promised but never delivered. His bank account showed numbers that made his stomach churn, barely enough to cover next month's mortgage payment, let alone the equipment repairs that kept piling up. The old John Deere tractor sat silent in the barn, its engine needing parts he couldn't afford, while weeds slowly claimed the fields he'd worked since childhood. His neighbors had already sold to developers, their farmhouses now surrounded by suburban sprawl, but Marcus held on to hope with the same stubborn determination that had kept his family rooted to this soil for decades. As he walked back toward the weathered farmhouse, movement on the distant county road caught his attention. A figure approached slowly, walking rather than driving, which was unusual for this stretch of highway, where most travelers passed by at 70 miles per hour without a second glance. The person moved with deliberate steps, carrying what appeared to be a large backpack, and Marcus found himself curious about anyone brave enough to walk these roads under the blazing afternoon sun. Years of farming had taught him to notice details others might miss, and something about this traveler seemed different, though he couldn't quite articulate what set off his instincts. The figure drew closer, revealing itself to be a woman in her 30s, dressed in practical hiking gear that looked expensive but well-used. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and despite the heat, she moved with the steady pace of someone accustomed to long distances. Marcus watched from his porch as she approached his driveway, noting the way she carried herself with quiet confidence, neither hurried nor hesitant. When she finally reached his gate, she paused and looked up at him with eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, from the peeling paint on his house to the struggling crops in his fields. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying a slight hoarseness that suggested she'd been walking for miles. "I hate to bother you, but I'm wondering if you might have Wi-Fi I could use for just a few minutes. My phone's completely dead, and I need to send a message to let someone know where I am." She gestured toward the empty road behind her, adding with a self-deprecating smile, "I may have miscalculated how long this walk would take." Marcus set down the tools he'd been carrying and walked toward the gate, studying this unexpected visitor. Up close, he could see that her hiking boots were dust-covered, but of exceptional quality, and her backpack bore the subtle logos of high-end outdoor gear companies. Despite her casual appearance, there was something refined about her courting features, an intelligence in her eyes that suggested education and experience beyond what one might expect from a typical backpacker. Still, she looked genuinely tired and in need of help, and Marcus had been raised to assist travelers in distress. "Of course," he replied, unlatching the gate and gesturing toward his house. "Come on up to the porch, you can get some shade while you're at it. The network name is Delaney Farm, and the password is just Harvest 2020. Fair warning though, the connection's pretty slow out here, so it might take a minute to get through." He watched as relief washed over her features, genuine gratitude replacing the careful politeness she'd initially displayed. As they walked toward the house, Marcus found himself stealing glances at his guest, trying to piece together her story. She moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable in the outdoors, but her hands looked too soft for serious manual labor, and there was something about her bearing that suggested authority, as if she were accustomed to being listened to when she spoke. The contradiction intrigued him, though he kept his curiosity to himself out of politeness. "This is incredibly kind of you," she said as they reached the porch. "Most people wouldn't trust a stranger with their internet access." She pulled out a sleek smartphone that Marcus recognized as one of the latest models. Worth more than he made in several months of farming, the device powered on immediately when she pressed the button. its screen displaying the kind of crisp clarity that came with premium technology. "Around here, we help each other out," Marcus replied, settling into one of the old wooden chairs that had belonged to his grandfather. "Besides, it's not like I'm using much bandwidth watching the corn refuse to grow." Brr. He gestured toward his struggling fields with a rueful laugh, though the humor didn't quite mask the underlying worry in his voice. The woman looked up from her phone, following his gaze across the parched landscape. Her expression grew thoughtful as she took in the extent of the drought damage, and Marcus noticed that she seemed to be calculating something, her mind working behind those bead, intelligent eyes. "How long has it been this dry?" she asked, her question carrying more technical interest than casual sympathy. 3 months without decent rain," Marcus admitted, surprised by his willingness to share details with a complete stranger. "The irrigation system's running constantly, but it's fighting a losing battle. Water table's dropping faster than I can pump it up, and the electricity bills are eating me alive." He paused, wondering why he was confiding in this woman, but something about her manner invited honesty. She nodded slowly, her fingers working across her phone's screen with practiced efficiency. "Drought's been hitting farmers hard across the Midwest this year. Have you considered any of the new sustainable irrigation technologies? Some of them can reduce water usage by 60%, while actually improving crop yields." The question was asked casually, but Marcus detected an undercurrent of genuine interest that seemed odd for a random hiker. "Can't afford new anything right now," Marcus replied with a bitter laugh. "Hell, I can barely keep the old equipment running. Modern farming's become a rich man's game, and I'm definitely not rich." He watched as her typing slowed, her attention seemingly divided between her phone and their conversation. The woman looked up from her device, studying Marcus with renewed interest. "You mind if I ask how long your family's been farming this land?" There was something different in her tone now, a subtle shift that suggested this was more than idle curiosity. "My great-grandfather bought this place in 1923, Marcus said, pride creeping into his voice despite his current troubles. 160 acres of the best farmland in Lancaster County, or at least it used to be. Grandpa expanded it to 300 acres, and my dad made it profitable enough to support our whole family. Now I'm about to lose it all because I can't adapt fast enough to keep up with changing times." She set her phone aside, giving him her full attention. What would it take to save the farm? The question was direct, almost businesslike, and Marcus found himself answering honestly despite barely knowing this woman. "More money than I'll ever see," he replied. "Need new irrigation equipment, soil restoration, maybe solar panels to offset the power costs. The bank's breathing down my neck, and I've got maybe 6 months before they foreclose. Then trying to figure out if there's anything valuable about this place that I'm missing, but land around here isn't worth what it used to be." The woman's phone buzzed with an incoming message, and she glanced at it briefly before returning her attention to Marcus. "Sometimes value isn't immediately obvious," she said carefully. "Good land, sustainable practices, proximity to transportation networks. These things matter more than people realize." She paused, seeming to weigh her words. "And sometimes the most valuable resource is the person working the land." Marcus studied her face, noting the way she spoke about farming with more knowledge than a casual hiker should possess. "You sound like you know something about agriculture," he observed, his farmer's instincts picking up on the subtle cues in her language and manner. "I've spent time studying various industries," she replied diplomatically. "Food production, sustainability, supply chain logistics. It's fascinating how interconnected everything is, how small changes in one area can have massive ripple effects throughout the system." Her phone buzzed again, and this time she frowned slightly as she read the message. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked, noticing the shift in her expression. She sighed, looking suddenly tired. "Just work stuff. People who think they need immediate answers to everything, even when you're trying to take a break." She glanced around the farm again, her gaze lingering on the farmhouse and outbuildings. "This is peaceful out here. I can see why your family stayed." "Peaceful might not be the word I'd use," Marcus said, with a rueful smile. "Stressful, challenging, sometimes heartbreaking, but I suppose there are worse ways to spend your life than working land that's been in your family for generations." He watched as she checked her phone again, noting the frequency of the incoming messages. "Popular person?" he asked lightly. "Something like that," she replied, her tone suggesting she'd rather not elaborate. "I should probably head back to town soon, but I want to thank you again for the Wi-Fi. And for the conversation. It's nice to talk to someone who doesn't want anything from you except basic human kindness." Marcus felt a pang of curiosity about this mysterious traveler, but his ingrained politeness prevented him from prying further. "Well, you're welcome to rest here as long as you need. Can I get you some water for the road? It's brutal out there in this heat." "That would be wonderful, thank you," she said, standing and stretching slightly. As she moved, Marcus noticed a small logo on her hiking shirt, something that looked familiar, but which he couldn't quite place. The design was simple, but elegant, the kind of subtle branding that spoke of expensive taste rather than flashy display. He returned with a large bottle of cold water, condensation already forming on its surface in the humid air. "This should get you wherever you're headed," he said, handing it to her. "And seriously, if you ever find yourself walking past here again, don't hesitate to stop. It gets lonely out here sometimes." She accepted the water with genuine gratitude, her fingers briefly touching his as she took the bottle. "You're very kind, Marcus. I hope things turn around for you with the farm." She paused, seeming to consider saying something more, but then simply shouldered her backpack and prepared to leave. "You never told me your name," Marcus called after her as she reached the gate. She turned back with a smile that seemed to hold secrets. "Sarah," she said simply. "Maybe I'll see you around sometime." Marcus watched her disappear down the county road, her figure gradually becoming smaller until she was just another speck on the horizon. Something about the encounter left him unsettled, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. There had been an intensity to her questions, a knowledge behind her comments that seemed inconsistent with her stated identity as a casual hiker. But the heat was making him overthink things, and he had work to do before the day ended. The rest of the afternoon passed in routine farm maintenance, checking irrigation lines and monitoring the weather forecast that continued to promise rain that never materialized. As evening approached, Marcus found himself thinking about Sarah, wondering where she had come from and where she was headed. There had been something almost familiar about her, though he was certain they'd never met before. Perhaps it was simply that she'd listened to his problems without judgment, treating his struggles with respect rather than pity. 3 days later, Marcus was repairing fence posts when a convoy of expensive-looking vehicles turned into his driveway. The lead car was a sleek electric sedan that probably cost more than his annual income, followed by 2 SUVs with tinted windows. His first thought was that the bank had sent someone to assess the property, but repo men didn't usually travel in such style. He set down his tools and walked toward the house, trying to prepare himself for whatever bad news these visitors might bring. The sedan's door opened, and Sarah stepped out, though she looked dramatically different from the dusty hiker who had asked for Wi-Fi access earlier that week. She wore a tailored business suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and her entire demeanor had shifted from casual friendliness to corporate authority. Behind her, several other professionally dressed individuals emerged from the other vehicles, all carrying tablets and briefcases that suggested serious business. "Hello, Marcus," Sarah said, walking toward him with the same confident stride he remembered, though now it carried unmistakable executive presence. "I hope you don't mind a surprise visit. We have some things to discuss." Marcus stared at her, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the hiker he'd helped days earlier. "Sarah?" he managed, though even as he said the name, he suspected it might not be her real one. "Actually, it's Dr. Sarah Chen," she replied with a slight smile. "I'm the founder and CEO of Verde Technologies. Perhaps you've heard of us?" The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Verde Technologies was one of the most valuable companies in the world, specializing in sustainable agriculture and renewable energy solutions. Their innovations had revolutionized farming across 6 continents, and their stock price was a frequent topic on financial news programs. Marcus began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the implications. "But you were just a hiker. You needed Wi-Fi." The mundane nature of their first encounter seemed absurd in light of this revelation. "I was taking a break from the corporate world," Sarah explained, her expression growing warmer as she noted his shock. Walking gives me time to think, to remember why I started Verde in the first place. I grew up on a farm not unlike this one, and I never forget that behind all our technology and business deals are real people, trying to make a living from the land. One of her assistants stepped forward with a tablet, but Sarah waved him back with a subtle gesture. Marcus, I've been thinking about our conversation ever since I left here. Your farm represents exactly the kind of operation Verde was designed to help. And your situation is unfortunately common across agricultural America. Small family farms are disappearing because they can't access the technologies that could save them. End quote. Marcus felt dizzy, the surreal nature of the situation making it difficult to process what was happening. I don't understand. Why are you here? What do you want with my farm? I want to save it, Sarah replied simply. And I want to use it as a demonstration site for sustainable farming practices that could help thousands of other farmers in similar situations. But more than that, I want to offer you a partnership that could change not just your life, but the entire agricultural landscape in this region. She gestured toward his struggling fields, her eyes taking in the full scope of the operation with the practiced assessment of someone who understood farming at a technical level. This land has incredible potential. The soil composition is ideal for the crops you're trying to grow. The climate is actually well suited for sustainable agriculture with the right techniques. And your location provides excellent access to both transportation networks and renewable energy infrastructure. End quote. But it's failing, Marcus protested, his ingrained pessimism making it difficult to accept what he was hearing. The drought, the debt, the equipment failures. I can barely keep the lights on, let alone make a profit. Because you're fighting the environment instead of working with it, Sarah explained, pulling out her own tablet and showing him detailed satellite images of his property. Look at this thermal imaging data. Your current irrigation system is incredibly inefficient, losing nearly 40% of its water to evaporation and ground seepage. But see these underground features? She pointed to strange patterns in the imagery that Marcus had never noticed. There are natural aquifer connections running through your property that could provide sustainable water access with the right extraction techniques. Marcus stared at the images, seeing his familiar land transformed into a complex map of hidden resources and untapped potential. How did you get this information? Verde has been developing precision agriculture technologies for 8 years, Sarah replied. We use satellite imagery, soil sensors, weather prediction algorithms, and dozens of other data sources to optimize farming operations. The technology exists to make your farm not just profitable, but a model for sustainable agriculture throughout the Midwest. She swiped to another screen, showing financial projections that made Marcus's eyes widen. With proper implementation of our systems, this operation could be generating significant profits within 18 months. But more importantly, it would be doing so while actually improving the land rather than depleting it. One of Sarah's assistants approached with a folder of documents, but she continued speaking directly to Marcus. I'm proposing a partnership. Verde will invest in completely modernizing your operation, covering all equipment costs, infrastructure upgrades, and operational expenses for the first 2 years. In exchange, we use your farm as a research and demonstration site, showing other farmers how these technologies can transform their operations. What's the catch? Marcus asked, his practical nature asserting itself despite the overwhelming generosity of the offer. No catch, Sarah replied. You maintain ownership of your land, you keep all profits after our initial investment is recovered, and you have the option to buy out Verde's stake at any time. Additionally, I'd like to offer you a position as Director of Agricultural Operations for our Midwest expansion. You'd be traveling to other farms, helping implement the same systems we develop here, sharing your knowledge with farmers who are facing the same challenges you've overcome. Marcus felt his legs grow weak, and he sat down heavily on his porch steps. The magnitude of what Sarah was proposing seemed impossible to grasp. Why me? Why my farm? There must be thousands of operations that would jump at this opportunity. Sarah sat down beside him, her corporate authority momentarily giving way to the more personal warmth he remembered from their first meeting. Because when I asked for help, you gave it without question. Because you talked about your land and your family's history with genuine love. Not just financial calculation. Because you're facing impossible odds, and still getting up every morning to fight for something you believe in." She paused, looking out over his struggling fields, with an expression that mixed professional assessment with personal understanding. "But mostly because I see myself in your situation. When I started Verde, everyone told me that sustainable agriculture was impossible on a commercial scale, that farmers would never adopt new technologies, that I was too young and too idealistic to understand how the real world worked." End quote. "How did you prove them wrong?" Marcus asked, finding himself genuinely curious about her story. "By finding farmers like you," Sarah replied. "People who understood the land, who were willing to take risks if it meant saving their family's legacy, who could bridge the gap between cutting-edge technology and practical agricultural knowledge." Verde's success came from partnerships with farmers who were desperate enough to try something new and smart enough to make it work. Marcus looked at the documents her assistant was holding, still struggling to believe this was really happening. What would the timeline be? How quickly could things change? "We could have crews here within 2 weeks," Sarah replied. "Soil analysis, water table assessment, equipment installation, the whole process would take about 4 months to complete. You'd start seeing results almost immediately, but full optimization would take a complete growing season." She pulled up another screen on her tablet, showing detailed plans for his property that seemed almost magical in their comprehensiveness. "Solar panel installation here to offset all your energy costs and actually generate surplus power you can sell back to the grid. New irrigation systems that use 70% less water while providing more consistent soil moisture. Soil enhancement programs that will increase your crop yields by an average of 40% while building long-term soil health." "And if it doesn't work?" Marcus asked, his practical caution warring with growing excitement. "Then Verde absorbs all the losses," Sarah said firmly. "Your land remains yours, clear of all debt, regardless of the outcome." "But Marcus, I've been developing these technologies for nearly a decade. I've seen them work on farms, from Iowa to Indonesia. They will work here." Marcus stood up, walking to the edge of his porch and looking out over the land that had defined his family for generations. The corn stalks still stood withered and brown. The soil still cracked from lack of moisture, but for the first time in months, he could imagine them green and thriving. "When would you need an answer?" "Take all the time you need," Sarah replied, though something in her tone suggested she hoped for a quick decision. "But Marcus, this isn't just about saving your farm. This is about demonstrating that small-scale agriculture can be both profitable and sustainable, that family farms don't have to disappear to make room for industrial operations." She gestured toward the road, where development signs marked other properties that had been sold to housing developers. "In 5 years, this entire area could be suburbs unless we prove there's another way. Your success could inspire hundreds of other farmers to try sustainable practices instead of selling to developers." The weight of that responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders, but instead of feeling overwhelming, it felt purposeful. "What about my debt? The bank notices, the mortgage payments I can't make?" "Verde will handle all existing debt as part of the partnership agreement," one of Sarah's assistants interjected, speaking for the first time. "Your accounts will be current within 48 hours of signing." Marcus turned back to Sarah, studying her face for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. Instead, he saw the same honest directness that had impressed him during their first meeting, though now he understood the confidence behind it came from experience and success rather than mere optimism. "I keep thinking this is too good to be true," he admitted. "People don't just show up and offer to save your life out of kindness. They do when your kindness reminded them why they got into business in the first place," Sarah replied. "Marcus, I've been running Verde for 8 years, dealing with investors in board meetings and corporate politics. Every day. I started taking these walking trips because I was losing sight of why any of it mattered. When you offered me Wi-Fi and water without asking for anything in return, you reminded me that business should be about helping people, not just making profit." She stood up, smoothing her suit jacket in a gesture that seemed almost unconscious. "But I want to be completely transparent with you. This partnership will benefit Verde enormously. We'll gain valuable research data, a demonstration site for potential customers, and proof that our technologies work in challenging conditions. This isn't charity, It's smart business that happens to align with doing the right thing. Marcus appreciated her honesty, finding it easier to accept help when it was framed as mutual benefit rather than charity. What happens if I say yes? What changes immediately? Everything, Sarah replied with a grin that transformed her corporate facade back into something more human. Within a week, you'll have crews here doing soil analysis and water table mapping. Within a month, new equipment will be arriving. Within 3 months, you'll have the most advanced agricultural operation in Nebraska. She paused, her expression growing more serious. But Marcus, I need you to understand that this will be hard work, learning new systems, adapting to new technologies, working with our research teams to optimize everything. You'll be essentially learning to farm all over again, using methods that might seem strange at first. I've been farming this land for 20 years, Marcus replied. If there's a better way to do it, I want to learn. The determination in his voice surprised even him, as if Sarah's confidence was somehow contagious. Then let's save your farm, Sarah said, extending her hand. Partners? Marcus looked at her outstretched hand, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 3 days ago, he'd been facing bankruptcy and the loss of everything his family had built. Now, he was being offered not just salvation, but the chance to be part of something that could revolutionize agriculture across the country. He shook her hand firmly, feeling the calluses on his palm meet the surprisingly strong grip of someone who had built an empire through determination and vision. Partners. The next several hours passed in a blur of paperwork, technical discussions, and planning sessions that left Marcus's head spinning. Sarah's team was incredibly efficient, having apparently prepared extensively for this possibility. Contracts were reviewed and signed, financial arrangements were finalized, and detailed timelines were established for every aspect of the farm's history. Transformation. As the sun began to set, painting the struggling fields in golden light that made them look almost beautiful despite their condition, Sarah's convoy prepared to leave. She walked with Marcus to the edge of his property, looking out over land that would soon be transformed beyond recognition. Are you scared? She asked, her question carrying genuine concern. Terrified, Marcus admitted, but also more excited than I've been in years. For the first time since Dad died, I feel like this place might have a future. It will, Sarah assured him. And not just as a farm, but as proof that sustainable agriculture can work on any scale, anywhere. Marcus, what we're starting here could change how the entire world thinks about food production. As her cars disappeared down the county road, Marcus stood alone on his porch, looking out over his land with new eyes. The corn stalks were still brown and withered, the soil still cracked and dry. But now he could see past the immediate problems to the potential beneath. In his mind, he could already envision the solar panels gleaming in the morning sun, the efficient irrigation systems breathing life back into his fields, the healthy crops that would soon replace the failing ones. 3 weeks later, Marcus barely recognized his own farm. Crews of technicians and engineers had transformed the property into something resembling a high-tech research facility. Massive solar panel arrays covered the barn roof and stretched across a dedicated field, generating more electricity than the farm could use. New irrigation systems snaked through the ground, controlled by sensors that monitored soil moisture, temperature, and nutrient levels in real time. The most dramatic change was in the fields themselves. Where brown dying corn had struggled against the drought, new crops specially selected for the soil conditions and climate were already showing green shoots. The transformation wasn't just visual, it was philosophical. Instead of fighting against environmental conditions, the new systems worked with them, using drought-resistant crops, water-efficient irrigation, and solar power to create a sustainable cycle that actually improved with time. Sarah visited frequently during the installation process, sometimes arriving in her corporate sedan with a team of assistants, other times showing up alone in hiking gear as if recreating their first meeting. During these visits, she and Marcus would walk the fields together, discussing the technical details of each system and the broader implications of what they were creating. The soil analysis results are incredible, Sarah told him during one such walk, showing him data on her tablet that looked like something from a science fiction movie. The nutrient levels have improved by 30% in just 3 weeks. The new irrigation system isn't just conserving water, it's actually helping the soil retain nutrients more effectively. Marcus studied the complex charts and graphs, still amazed by the technology that was transforming his land. I never realized how much science was involved in farming. My grandfather would have called this magic. In a way it is, Sarah replied. We're using technology to amplify the natural processes that have always made agriculture possible. Your grandfather was doing the same thing with more primitive tools, but the fundamental principles haven't changed. As they reached the highest point on his property, Marcus could see the full scope of the transformation. His farm had become a demonstration of what sustainable agriculture could accomplish, but more than that, it had become a symbol of hope for farmers throughout the region. Word of the partnership had spread, and Marcus found himself fielding calls from neighboring farmers who wanted to know more about Verdi's technologies. Speaking of which, Sarah said, as if reading his thoughts, I have something to discuss with you. The board of directors wants to accelerate our Midwest expansion plan. Instead of waiting 2 years to start working with other farms, they want to begin immediately, using your PE operation as the model. Marcus felt a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension. What would that mean exactly? It means your new job starts sooner than we planned, Sarah replied with a grin. We've got 12 farms already lined up for partnerships, all within 100 miles of here. You'd be spending about half your time traveling to these operations, helping them implement the same systems we've developed here. The prospect was both thrilling and intimidating. Marcus had spent his entire life on this single farm, and the idea of traveling throughout the region as an agricultural consultant seemed almost impossible to imagine. Yet he found himself drawn to the possibility of helping other farmers avoid the struggles he'd endured. Would I be qualified for something like that? He asked. I mean, most of this technology is still new to me. You're more qualified than anyone else Verdi could hire, Sarah assured him. You understand both the traditional farming methods and the new technologies. More importantly, you can relate to farmers who are skeptical about change because you've been where they are. Over the following months, Marcus found himself living a life he could never have imagined. His mornings were spent managing his own farm, now running so efficiently that it required a fraction of the labor he'd previously invested. The automated systems monitored everything from soil moisture to plant health, alerting him to problems before they became serious and optimizing growing conditions continuously. His afternoons were often spent traveling to other farms, working with families who were facing the same challenges he'd overcome. Each operation presented unique problems, but the solutions followed similar patterns. Sustainable water management, renewable energy integration, soil health optimization, and crop selection based on scientific analysis rather than traditional practices. The work was incredibly rewarding, but also emotionally challenging. Many of the farmers he worked with were in desperate situations, facing bankruptcy or forced sales to developers. Marcus found himself becoming not just a technical consultant, but a counselor and advocate for people who had been forgotten by rapid agricultural consolidation. It's not just about the technology, he told Sarah during one of their regular check-ins. These people need to know that someone understands what they're going through, that there's still a place for family farms in modern agriculture. That's exactly why you're perfect for this job, Sarah replied. Verdi can provide the technology, but you provide the human connection that makes farmers willing to try something new. As his first year with Verdi came to an end, Marcus reflected on the incredible changes in his life. His farm was not only profitable, but had become a showcase for sustainable agriculture, attracting visitors from around the world who wanted to see proof that small-scale farming could be both economically viable and environmentally beneficial. More importantly, he had found a sense of purpose that went beyond simply surviving. Every farmer he helped save from bankruptcy, every operation that successfully transitioned to sustainable practices, every family that remained on land that had been theirs for generations, represented a victory not just for Verdi Technologies, but for the fundamental principle that agriculture could be both modern and human-scaled. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Learning to use advanced agricultural technologies while maintaining the practical knowledge that had served his family for generations required constant adaptation. Some traditional farming communities were skeptical of the high-tech approaches Verdi promoted, viewing them as threats to established ways of life, rather than tools for preservation. But Marcus had developed a talent for bridging these cultural gaps, translating between the worlds of cutting-edge technology and traditional agriculture. His presentations to farmer groups were attended by hundreds of people who wanted to hear from someone who had successfully made the transition without losing his connection to the land. The key is remembering that technology serves agriculture, not the other way around, he would tell audiences of skeptical farmers. Every sensor, every automated system, every piece of software is designed to help you do what you already know how to do, just more efficiently and sustainably. Sarah attended one of these presentations, watching from the back of a packed auditorium as Marcus explained complex agricultural technologies in terms that practical farmers could understand and accept. Afterward, as they walked through another demonstration farm that Verdi had helped establish, she reflected on how much had changed since their first meeting. "When I offered you Wi-Fi that day, I never imagined it would lead to this," Marcus said, gesturing toward fields that were thriving despite ongoing drought conditions throughout the region. "I think I knew," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "Not the specifics, but I recognized something in you that reminded me why Verdi exists in the first place. Most people in agriculture are either completely traditional or completely high-tech, but you understood both perspectives from the beginning." End quote. As they reached the demonstration farm's central facility, Marcus marveled at how routine these incredible technological achievements had become. Solar panels generated clean energy. Automated irrigation systems maintained optimal growing conditions, and sophisticated monitoring equipment tracked everything from soil chemistry to plant genetics. Yet despite all the advanced technology, the fundamental work remained the same: growing food, stewarding the land, and maintaining the connection between human communities and the natural world that sustained them. "What's next for Verdi?" Marcus asked as they reviewed production reports that showed yields increasing, while environmental impact decreased across all their partner farms. "Global expansion," Sarah replied, her eyes lighting up with the same visionary excitement he'd first glimpsed during their initial conversation. "We've proven that sustainable agriculture works in the American Midwest. Now we want to demonstrate it everywhere else. And Marcus, I want you to lead the international consultation program." The offer was staggering in its implications. Marcus would be traveling around the world, working with farmers in developing countries to implement sustainable practices that could lift entire communities out of poverty while protecting vital ecosystems. It represented an opportunity to impact global food security in ways he'd never dreamed possible. "That sounds incredible," Marcus replied honestly, "but also terrifying. I'm still learning how to help farmers in Nebraska. How could I possibly advise people in completely different climates and cultures?" "The same way you've been doing it here," Sarah assured him. "By listening, by understanding that every farm is unique, and by remembering that behind every agricultural challenge is a family trying to make a living from the land. The technology adapts to local conditions, but the human elements remain constant." 6 months later, Marcus found himself standing in a rice field in Vietnam, working with farmers whose challenges were both completely different from and remarkably similar to those he'd faced in Nebraska. The crops were different, the climate was different, the cultural context was different, but the fundamental struggle remained the same: how to make small-scale agriculture profitable and sustainable in a rapidly changing world. The Vietnamese farmers were initially skeptical of the American consultant who claimed to understand their problems. But Marcus had learned to let his work speak for itself. Within weeks, the pilot program he'd established was showing remarkable results, with crop yields increasing while water usage decreased and soil health improved. "Mr. Marcus," one of the local farmers said through a translator, "your methods are like magic, but they also make sense. How did you learn to farm this way?" Marcus smiled, thinking back to that dusty afternoon when a mysterious hiker had asked to use his Wi-Fi. "I learned from someone who understood that the best technology serves traditional wisdom rather than replacing it," he replied, "and that sometimes the most important innovations come from the most unexpected places." As his international work expanded, Marcus maintained his base of operations at his original farm in Nebraska, which had become something of a pilgrimage site for sustainable agriculture advocates. Farmers, researchers, investors, and policymakers from around the world came to see proof that small-scale farming could be both economically viable and environmentally beneficial. During one such visit, a group of agricultural students from the state university asked Marcus to explain how his partnership with Verdi had developed. As he told the story of Sarah's unexpected arrival and their initial conversation, he realized how much his perspective on business and technology had evolved. "The most important thing I learned," he told the students, "is that real innovation happens when you combine cutting-edge technology with genuine human connection." Sarah could have implemented these same systems anywhere, but she chose to work with farmers who were struggling because she understood that sustainable agriculture isn't just about efficiency. It's about preserving communities and ways of life that have value beyond mere economic calculation. One student raised her hand. "But wasn't it risky for Dr. Chen to invest so much in unproven partnerships?" Verdi Technologies could have lost millions if the program failed. Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think the bigger risk would have been developing sustainable agriculture technologies without involving the farmers who actually need to use them." Sarah understood that the most sophisticated equipment in the world is worthless if the people using it don't understand why it matters or how it connects to their larger goals. As the students left, Marcus walked through his fields, marveling at how completely his life had changed in just 2 years. The corn that had once struggled against drought now grew tall and healthy, supported by irrigation systems that used precisely the amount of water needed, and no more. Solar panels not only powered all farm operations, but generated surplus electricity that provided Bashame additional income. Most importantly, the soil itself was healthier than it had been in decades, rich with nutrients and beneficial microorganisms that ensured long-term productivity. But the physical transformation of his farm was only part of the story. Marcus had discovered a sense of purpose that extended far beyond his own land. Through his work with Verdi, he had helped dozens of farming families avoid bankruptcy and stay connected to land that had been in their families for generations. Each success felt personal, a validation not just of sustainable agricultural practices, but of the principle that business could be a force for preserving rather than destroying traditional communities. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah, who was currently in Brazil, establishing Verdi's South American operations. "How did the university visit go?" she asked. The student seemed excited about the internship program. Marcus smiled as he typed his response. The internship program had been his idea, a way to ensure that the next generation of agricultural professionals understood both traditional farming wisdom and cutting-edge sustainable technologies. Students would spend summers working on Verdi partner farms, learning to integrate scientific innovation with practical farming knowledge. "They're eager to get started," he replied. 3 of them are already talking about specializing in sustainable agriculture, and one wants to focus specifically on small farm consultation. "Perfect," Sarah responded. "We'll need hundreds of consultants like you as we expand globally. Speaking of which, how do you feel about spending next month in Kenya? We've got a pilot program starting with coffee farmers who are dealing with climate change impacts." Marcus looked out over his Nebraska fields, thinking about coffee farmers halfway around the world who were facing challenges not unlike those he'd overcome. The work was demanding, requiring constant travel and adaptation to new agricultural contexts, but it had given him a sense of contribution that he'd never experienced during his years of struggling alone with his failing farm. "Send me the details," he typed back. "I'll start researching coffee cultivation practices and climate adaptation strategies." As evening approached, Marcus made his traditional walk around the perimeter of his property, checking systems that largely ran themselves but benefiting from the human oversight that technology couldn't replace. The quote, "Automated sensors provided data, but experienced eyes could spot problems or opportunities that even sophisticated algorithms might miss." Near the northwest corner of his land, he paused at a small memorial he'd erected for his grandfather, the man who had taught him to love farming despite its challenges and uncertainties. The simple stone marker was surrounded by native prairie grasses that had been restored as part of Verde's biodiversity enhancement program, creating habitat for beneficial insects and birds while providing natural pest control for his crops. "You probably wouldn't recognize this place now, Grandpa," Marcus said aloud, a habit he'd developed during his solitary evening walks. "But I think you'd approve of what we're trying to accomplish. We're still feeding people, still taking care of the land, just using better tools to do it." A gentle breeze stirred the prairie grasses, carrying the scent of healthy soil and growing plants. Marcus had learned to read these subtle signs, understanding that the ecosystem surrounding his farm was as important as the crops themselves. The integrated approach Verde promoted recognized that sustainable agriculture required thinking beyond individual fields to consider entire landscapes and their interconnected relationships. His phone rang, interrupting his contemplation. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, which was unusual since she typically preferred text messages during her international travels. "Marcus," she said when he answered, her voice carrying excitement, despite the poor connection. "I have news that couldn't wait for email. The United Nations wants Verde to lead a global initiative on sustainable agriculture. They're offering funding for 100 demonstration farms across 6 continents, all based on the model we developed at your place." Marcus felt his heartbeat quicken as he processed the implications. "That's incredible, Sarah. But also enormous. How would we possibly manage something that large?" "Very carefully, and with the right team," she replied. "Marcus, I want you to serve as Global Director of Farm Partnerships. You'd be responsible for selecting locations, training local consultants, and ensuring that each demonstration site maintains the human-centered approach that's made our program successful." The offer represented an opportunity to impact global food security on a scale Marcus had never imagined possible. Yet it also meant leaving behind the direct farming work that had defined his entire life, transitioning fully into a role that was more about teaching and consulting than hands-on agriculture. "Can I think about it?" he asked, though he was already leaning toward acceptance. "Of course," Sarah replied. "But Marcus, I need you to understand something. This UN partnership isn't just about demonstrating sustainable agriculture techniques. It's about proving that small-scale farming can feed the world while protecting the environment. Your farm in Nebraska started as a desperate attempt to avoid bankruptcy. Now it's become the prototype for a global agricultural revolution." After ending the call, Marcus continued his evening walk, thinking about the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. Less than 3 years ago, he'd been facing the loss of everything his family had built over 4 generations. A chance encounter with a mysterious hiker had transformed not just his personal circumstances, but his entire understanding of what farming could become in the 21st century. The irony wasn't lost on him that his salvation had come from someone who had initially seemed to need his help. Sarah's request for Wi-Fi access had been genuine, but her true identity, as one of the world's most successful agricultural innovators, had turned a simple act of kindness into a life-changing partnership. As he reached his farmhouse, Marcus paused on the porch where he and Sarah had first sat together, discussing drought conditions and farming challenges. The view had changed dramatically since that day. Where struggling corn stalks had once withered in the heat, thriving crops now grew in neat rows supported by nearly invisible irrigation systems. Solar panels gleamed in the moonlight, silent generators of clean energy that had eliminated his electricity costs while providing surplus power to the grid. But the most significant change wasn't visible in grade. The landscape. Marcus had discovered that his knowledge and experience could serve a purpose beyond merely maintaining his family's farm. Through his work with Verde, he had learned that sustainable agriculture wasn't just about new technologies or farming techniques. It was about creating systems that supported both human communities and natural ecosystems. The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors, researchers, and journalists who had come to document the success of Verde's Nebraska demonstration site. Marcus had grown comfortable with these visits, understanding that publicity for sustainable agriculture practices could inspire adoption elsewhere. Each tour group included farmers facing challenges similar to those he had overcome, and their questions often reminded him of his own skepticism during the early days of his partnership with Verdi. The key thing to remember, he told a group of Iowa corn farmers who were dealing with similar drought conditions, is that these technologies don't replace traditional farming knowledge, they enhance it. Every sensor and automated system is designed to help you make better decisions based on more complete information. One farmer raised his hand. But what about the cost? Most of us are barely getting by as it is. How can we afford all this high-tech equipment? Marcus nodded, remembering his own financial desperation. That's exactly why Verdi structures these partnerships the way they do. They cover all the upfront costs, and you pay them back from increased profits over time. But more importantly, they're not trying to sell you equipment. They're trying to create long-term partnerships that benefit everyone involved. After the tour group left, Marcus received a call from one of the Verdi engineers who had been instrumental in designing his farm systems. Marcus, we've got some interesting data from your latest soil analysis. The carbon sequestration rates are exceeding our projections by almost 20%. Your farm is actually removing more atmospheric carbon than some forest ecosystems. The news was exciting, but not entirely surprising. Marcus had observed subtle changes in his soil quality that suggested the sustainable practices were having impacts beyond improved crop yields. The soil felt different under his hands. Richer and more alive than it had been during his years of conventional farming. What does that mean for the broader program? Marcus asked. It means that sustainable agriculture isn't just carbon neutral, it's carbon negative, the engineer replied. Farms like yours could play a significant role in addressing climate change, while simultaneously improving food security. The UN initiative Sarah mentioned isn't just about farming, it's about global environmental restoration. As Marcus absorbed this information, he realized that his decision about the global director position had essentially made itself. The opportunity to help establish demonstration farms that could address both food security and climate change was too important to decline, regardless of his personal preferences. That evening he called Sarah to accept the position. Her excitement was immediate and infectious, though she was careful to outline the challenges ahead. Marcus, this will be the most demanding work either of us has ever undertaken, she warned. We'll be working in countries with completely different agricultural traditions, political systems, and environmental conditions. Success will require adapting our techniques to circumstances we've never encountered before. That's what makes it worth doing, Marcus replied, surprising himself with his confidence. If sustainable agriculture only worked in ideal conditions, it wouldn't be sustainable. The real test is whether we can help farmers succeed regardless of their circumstances. Over the following months, Marcus threw himself into preparation for the global initiative. He studied agricultural practices from dozens of countries, learning about crops and growing conditions he had never encountered. He worked with translation services to ensure that technical concepts could be communicated accurately across language barriers. Importantly, he interviewed farmers from various countries who were already using traditional sustainable practices, understanding that innovation often involved rediscovering wisdom that had been forgotten rather than inventing entirely new approaches. The first international demonstration site was established in Ghana, where cocoa farmers were struggling with soil degradation and climate variability. Marcus spent 6 weeks there, working alongside local agricultural experts to adapt Verdi's technologies to tropical conditions and cultural contexts completely different from those he knew. The INEU work was challenging in ways he had never anticipated. Technical problems that seemed simple in Nebraska became complex when filtered through different soil conditions, climate patterns, and economic systems. More importantly, he had to learn to communicate across cultural barriers, understanding that sustainable agriculture meant different things to farmers whose primary concerns were subsistence rather than profit maximization. But the fundamental principles remained consistent. Farmers everywhere want to improve their yields while protecting their land for future generations. They were willing to try new approaches if those approaches respected their existing knowledge and addressed their specific challenges. Importantly, they responded to consultants who listened before offering advice and who understood that every farm was unique. Mr. Marcus, one Ghanaian farmer told him through a translator. Your techniques work because you understand that farming is about relationships, not just plants and soil. Relationship between farmer and land, between community and environment, between tradition and innovation. The insight was profound, helping Marcus articulate something he had intuitively understood but never fully verbalized. Sustainable agriculture wasn't primarily about technology or techniques. It was about creating harmonious relationships between human needs and natural systems. The most sophisticated equipment in the world was useless without farmers who understood their role as stewards, rather than merely extractors. As the Ghana project showed promising results, Marcus began developing training materials for the consultants who would establish demonstration sites in other countries. The challenge was creating educational resources that were technically accurate but culturally adaptable, providing frameworks that could be modified to fit local conditions, rather than rigid procedures that had to be followed exactly. The key, he explained to a group of agricultural students who would be serving as international consultants, is remembering that we're not teaching people how to farm. We're sharing technologies that can help them farm more effectively using principles they already understand. Our job is translation, not replacement. The success of the international program exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 18 months, demonstration sites were operating successfully on every continent except Antarctica, showing consistent improvements in crop yields, soil health, and water efficiency regardless of local conditions. More importantly, the program was beginning to influence agricultural policy at national and international levels, with governments recognizing sustainable practices as essential for long-term food security. Marcus found himself testifying before congressional committees, presenting at international conferences, and advising government agencies on agricultural policy. The shy Nebraska farmer who had once struggled to make mortgage payments was now recognized as one of the world's leading experts on sustainable agriculture implementation. But success brought new challenges. The rapid expansion of Verde's programs created enormous administrative demands, and Marcus sometimes missed the direct connection to farming that had originally drawn him to agriculture. His days were increasingly filled with meetings, reports, and strategic planning sessions, rather than the hands-on work with soil and plants that he loved. During one particularly stressful week of international travel, Marcus called Sarah from an airport in Mumbai, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of their expanding responsibilities. I sometimes wonder if we've lost sight of what we're trying to accomplish, he confided. When I'm sitting in government meetings discussing agricultural statistics, I feel very far from that afternoon when you asked to use my Wi-Fi. Sarah's response was immediate and understanding. Marcus, do you remember why I was walking that day? I was trying to reconnect with the human reasons behind Verde's work. Maybe it's time for both of us to take a step back and remember why we started this partnership. Her suggestion led to a 2-week period when both Marcus and Sarah returned to hands-on farming work, spending their days in the fields rather than conference rooms. Marcus worked alongside farmers at various demonstration sites, relearning the satisfaction of direct agricultural labor, while observing how sustainable practices were being adapted to local conditions. The experience was rejuvenating but also educational. Marcus discovered that the most successful demonstration sites were those where local farmers had taken ownership of the sustainable practices, modifying and improving Verde's techniques based on their intimate knowledge of local conditions. The technology was important, but human creativity and local adaptation were equally crucial to long-term success. We've been thinking about this wrong, Marcus told Sarah, as they worked together in a rice field in Thailand. We're not just demonstrating sustainable agriculture, we're creating a global network of agricultural innovators who are constantly improving these practices based on their own experience. This insight led to a significant evolution in Verde's approach. Instead of simply establishing demonstration sites and moving on, they began creating permanent networks that connected farmers across different continents, allowing them to share innovations and learn from each other's experiences. Marcus found himself coordinating these international exchanges, helping rice farmers in Asia learn from wheat farmers in Africa and corn farmers in South America. The work was more complex than managing individual demonstration sites. But it was also more rewarding. Marcus could see that sustainable agriculture was becoming a global movement, rather than just a collection of isolated projects. Farmers who had initially been skeptical of new technologies were becoming advocates and innovators, developing their own improvements to the techniques Verde had introduced. As the 5th anniversary of his partnership with Verde approached, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary transformation not just in his own life, but in global agriculture. What had started as a desperate attempt to save a failing farm had evolved into a worldwide network of sustainable agricultural innovation that was reshaping how humanity thought about food production and environmental stewardship. The original demonstration site in Nebraska continued to serve as Verde's flagship operation, attracting thousands of visitors annually and generating data that informed agricultural policy around the world. But Marcus took particular pride in the fact that many of the farmers he had helped were now serving as consultants themselves, sharing their knowledge with others who faced similar challenges. During the anniversary celebration held at his farm, Marcus stood before an audience that included farmers from 6 continents, government officials, researchers, and journalists. As he looked out over the crowd, he thought about the unpredictable journey that had brought them all together. 5 years ago, he began, I was about to lose everything my family had built over 4 generations. A stranger asked to use my Wi-Fi, and that simple act of sharing led to a partnership that has changed not just my life, but the lives of thousands of farmers around the world. He paused, looking towards Sarah, who was standing at the back of the crowd with the same warm smile he remembered from their first meeting. What I've learned through this experience is that the most important innovations happen when people with different types of knowledge work together toward common goals. Sustainable agriculture isn't just about new technologies or ancient wisdom. It's about creating systems that honor both human needs and natural processes." End quote. As the celebration continued into the evening, Marcus walked through his fields one more time, marveling at how completely his understanding of farming had evolved. The corn grew tall and healthy, the soil teemed with beneficial microorganisms, and the integrated systems hummed quietly, managing resources with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. But the most significant change wasn't visible in the landscape or measurable in the data reports that documented his farm's success. Marcus had discovered that his true calling wasn't just growing crops, but growing possibilities, helping other farmers realize that sustainable agriculture could provide both economic security and environmental stewardship. As he reached the memorial for his grandfather, Marcus smiled, imagining what the old man would think about the global agricultural network that had grown from this single Nebraska farm. The stone marker was now surrounded not just by native prairie grasses, but by experimental plots where researchers tested new crop varieties and sustainable growing techniques. "We're still farming, Grandpa," Marcus said aloud, continuing his long-standing tradition of evening conversations with his ancestor. "Just on a much bigger scale than you ever imagined." The next morning brought news that the United Nations had approved funding for an additional 200 demonstration sites, expanding the Global Sustainable Agriculture Initiative into regions that had previously been considered too challenging for large-scale agricultural innovation. Marcus would be traveling to Arctic communities in Alaska, desert regions in Australia, and mountain villages in Peru, working with indigenous farmers whose traditional practices had maintained soil health for centuries. Each new location would present unique challenges, requiring creative adaptation of sustainable technologies to environmental and cultural conditions, unlike anything he had previously encountered. But Marcus approached these challenges with confidence born from experience, understanding that successful agricultural innovation required listening as much as teaching, learning as much as sharing knowledge. As he prepared for another international trip, Marcus received a handwritten letter from one of the first farmers he had helped through Verde's partnership program. The Iowa corn farmer had not only saved his family's operation, but had become a regional consultant himself, helping dozens of other farmers transition to sustainable practices. "Dear Marcus," the letter read, "I wanted you to know that my farm is now completely debt-free and more profitable than it's ever been, but more importantly, my soil is healthier than when my great-grandfather first broke this prairie. My kids are excited about farming for the first time in their lives, and they're studying agricultural science in college so they can be part of the sustainable agriculture movement. None of this would have been possible without your willingness to share what you learned. Thank you for showing us that farming can have a future that honors both tradition and innovation." End quote. The letter reminded Marcus of why he had accepted the challenges and responsibilities that came with global agricultural leadership. Every successful transition to sustainable practices represented not just improved crop yields or reduced environmental impact, but the preservation of rural communities and agricultural traditions that might otherwise have been lost to economic pressures and industrial consolidation. That evening, as Marcus packed for his trip to Alaska, Sarah called with news that Verdi Technologies had been selected to lead a 10-year international research initiative focused on climate-adaptive agriculture. The project would establish permanent research stations in 50 countries, creating a global network for developing and testing agricultural innovations designed to help farmers adapt to changing environmental conditions. "Marcus, this is what we've been working towards since that first day on your porch," Sarah said, her voice carrying the same visionary excitement he had learned to recognize. "We have the opportunity to ensure that sustainable agriculture becomes the foundation for global food security, regardless of how climate change affects growing conditions around the world." As Marcus looked out over his Nebraska fields, illuminated by solar-powered lighting systems that extended the effective working day while providing habitat for beneficial nocturnal insects, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The struggling farm that had once represented the potential end of his family's agricultural legacy had become the prototype for a global transformation in how humanity approached food production and environmental stewardship. The journey that had begun with a simple offer to share Wi-Fi with a dusty traveler had evolved into something neither he nor Sarah could have imagined that hot afternoon 5 years earlier. But perhaps that was the most important lesson Marcus had learned about sustainable agriculture and sustainable business practices. The most significant innovations often emerged from unexpected encounters between people who were willing to help each other without expecting anything in return. As he turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, Marcus smiled, thinking about the Alaskan farmers he would meet next week and the new challenges they would solve together. Tomorrow would bring new problems to address and new innovations to develop. But tonight, he was content to rest in the knowledge that his small act of hospitality had grown into a global movement that was changing how the world thought about the relationship between human communities and the natural systems that sustained them. The story that had begun with a failing farm and a chance encounter with a mysterious hiker had evolved into something much larger than either Marcus or Sarah had originally envisioned. But at its core, it remained what it had always been: a testament to the power of human connection, the importance of sharing knowledge and resources, and the possibility that business success could be measured not just in profits, but in the positive impact on communities and environments around the world. In the years that followed, Marcus's name would become synonymous with sustainable agriculture innovation, and Verdi Technologies would be recognized as one of the most successful and socially responsible companies in the bead world. But on quiet evenings when he walked through his Nebraska fields, Marcus always remembered that it had all started with a simple decision to share his Wi-Fi with a stranger who needed help. Proof that the most extraordinary transformations often began with the most ordinary acts of human kindness.